Okay, welcome back to our series in which we are looking at quotations from Macbeth. Today we're going to be looking at 7 quotes from Acts 2 and 3, and these are going to be quotations spoken by Macbeth. So, to begin with, from one of the most famous scenes in the play. As Macbeth prepares to commit Duncan's murder, Shakespeare gives him another soliloquy in which to express his doubts and anxieties. Macbeth's mental state appears to be deteriorating, it appears to be worsening, as he hallucinates a floating dagger pointing towards Duncan's chamber. He questions what he's seeing several times, and in this quote he even acknowledges that it may be a product of his fevered mind. Now, this is slightly less well known than the very famous "It's a dagger I see before me," but I think this one gives you a little bit more to get stuck into in terms of language to analyse. Macbeth asks, "Art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain?" So, Shakespeare uses this rhetorical question in Macbeth's soliloquy to present Macbeth's unsettled mental state as he hallucinates this floating dagger pointing towards Duncan's bedchamber. Macbeth seems to recognise that the dagger isn't real by calling it a dagger of the mind. He's thinking thoughts of murder, he's planning this regicide, and he questions whether this is simply a product of his imagination. Art thou but a dagger of the mind? So he's speaking here directly to this vision, questioning the nature of it. Now let's remember, Macbeth has already witnessed some strange and supernatural events in this play. He's already met the witches and heard their prophecies, so this perhaps isn't as strange to him as we might expect, but nevertheless it seems to disturb and unsettle him as several times he repeats this question, "Is this a dagger I see before me? Art thou but a dagger of the mind?" questioning the nature of what he's seeing. He says that it may be a false creation, something imaginary, proceeding from, coming from, his heat-oppressed brain. Now, heat-oppressed, these words evoke the idea that Macbeth is under pressure and mental strain due to the imminent murder, this regicide he's about to commit. And we wonder whether he could feel this way as a result of the prophecies, or perhaps because of Lady Macbeth's manipulations, he's feeling the pressure and the strain. Heat-oppressed gives this sense of almost a fevered mind, as though he is himself not quite well in this moment. And this isn't the only time that he hallucinates within the play. After committing the murder, Macbeth suffers something akin to a breakdown. He believes that he's heard voices talking about Duncan's murder, and he begins talking almost incomprehensibly to Lady Macbeth. He starts sort of babbling frantically. He's accidentally brought the murder weapons out of the chamber, but he refuses to go back inside out of his horror at what he's done. He says, "I dare not." He doesn't want to go back in because he's scared to confront the corpse, the body that he's left there. Ultimately, the moments in the aftermath of the murder reveal a man who is in utter horror and disbelief at the brutal act that he has committed. So in these lines, "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more, Macbeth does murder, sleep,' we see again the deteriorating, worsening state of mind that Macbeth is now in. "Methought I heard a voice cry" literally means "I thought I heard a voice saying." So after Duncan's murder, he's hallucinating again, this time imagining he's hearing voices talking about what he has done. And these hallucinations seem to be provoked by his guilt and the stress of the crime that he's committed. Now, this is a really interesting line because it begins to introduce a motif, a recurring image that comes again and again and again throughout the play, and that is this idea of sleep. Sleep becomes symbolic of peace in the play. After Duncan's murder, Macbeth struggles to sleep, perhaps due to his guilt and his growing paranoia, and even Lady Macbeth, who initially is calm after Duncan's murder, is seen sleepwalking by Act 5 and guiltily trying to wash imaginary blood from her hands. So even though this is a hallucination, this idea that Macbeth has murdered sleep is really quite a good example of foreshadowing within the play. Macbeth has killed his own peace of mind when he kills Duncan. He's never going to sleep easily again. He's always going to be haunted by what he's done. Okay, moving on to Act 2, Scene 2. We see here really clearly Macbeth's guilt at Duncan's murder. So here again Shakespeare is illustrating Macbeth's horror and his shame at what he's done. Now let's remember that this is a man who up until now has lived a life characterised by loyalty, bravery and honour in the service of his beloved King Duncan. Now he's become a traitor, having abandoned his morality in the pursuit of power and his own personal gain, and these lines reveal his guilt at what he's done. He knows that this act can never be undone. So he says, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" Now, this allusion to Neptune as the god of the sea, this is being used to imply that an entire ocean's worth of water wouldn't be enough to wash the blood from Macbeth's hands. Now, obviously this is metaphorical. Of course an ocean would be plenty of water to do that. But Macbeth is talking about blood to represent guilt. Shakespeare uses blood as an image throughout the play, and every time it represents the guilt at this original crime. So this question that Macbeth is asking, this rhetorical question, suggests that Macbeth knows he will never be rid of his guilt over the regicide. He will always have blood on his hands. He will always be stained by this guilt of what he has done. So blood becomes symbolic of guilt throughout the play, and you might again think about Lady Macbeth trying to wash that imaginary blood from her hands. Now, Lady Macbeth is a really fascinating character within the play, and this image of washing hands recurs more than once. Lady Macbeth argues in Act 2, Scene 2 that a little water clears us of this deed, basically saying, once we've washed our hands, we're no longer visibly guilty. But Macbeth recognises that their guilt is ineradicable, it cannot be removed. This motif is repeated again in Act 5, as we've mentioned, as Lady Macbeth repeatedly tries to wash her hands clean of that imagined blood. Okay, on to Act 3, Scene 1, in which Macbeth's ambition grows. So throughout the play, Shakespeare explores the idea that Macbeth's ambition will never be satisfied. It's his fatal flaw, the spur that drives him towards increasingly barbaric actions. Now that he's on the throne, he's afraid that it will be taken from him. Banquo, whose prophecy claimed that he would be father to a line of kings, is a source of paranoia for Macbeth. Will Banquo be tempted to murder Macbeth as he murdered Duncan? Will he be driven to commit regicide in a bid to secure the throne for his son? These are the thoughts that are constantly going around and around in Macbeth's mind. So having achieved the throne, one of the first things he says in a soliloquy is, "To be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus," meaning to be king is pointless unless I am safe on the throne. So, to be thus. When he says to be thus, he's referring to the state of being king, to be this, to be in this position. So he's achieved his goal of becoming king, but he's immediately paranoid. And Shakespeare uses this Act 3, Scene 1 soliloquy to explore the idea that Macbeth's fatal ambition never will be satisfied. It's this constant gnawing thing that must be fed. So he says to be thus is nothing. He finds no pleasure in his role as king. And let's remember that. Macbeth commits that first awful, bloody crime in order to achieve something that he thinks will satisfy him, will reward him in some way. But as soon as he's on the throne, he's simply eaten up by these thoughts of paranoia and fear. He takes no pleasure in his new position. He says to be thus is nothing but to be safely thus. So having achieved the role of king, he becomes increasingly paranoid. He fears for his safety. He becomes obsessed with holding on to power and fears that Banquo, whose prophecy told him he would be father to a line of kings, may try to take the throne, perhaps killing him in the same way that Macbeth killed Duncan. And this idea is developed into Act 3, Scene 2, as Macbeth grows increasingly paranoid, and his paranoia is shown to be affecting his mind and sanity. On the day of his coronation feast, he sits alone in the castle in a dark and troubled state. Lady Macbeth finds him and urges him to forget the murder of Duncan. This is what she thinks is preoccupying him. But Macbeth's mind is now fixed on new threats to his power, or at least threats that he imagines are there, Banquo and Fleance. And here he expresses his fears. He says, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife." Now, I love this line. There's so much metaphor that we can unpack here. Full of scorpions, this imagery conveys Macbeth's disturbed and paranoid mental state. Scorpions are vicious and dangerous creatures, so that could refer perhaps to Banquo and Fleance. He sees them as threats, as vicious threats to his power. But it could also be seen to represent Macbeth himself. Remember, he's previously been metaphorically described as a serpent, when Lady Macbeth says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." We know that he's dwelling on this murder and plotting another, so he may be obsessing over these acts of violence. Full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. Now, Lady Macbeth is Macbeth's only confidant at this point in the play. He trusts no one else. She is the only one that knows the truth of what they did to Duncan, and he keeps her close in this moment. Dear wife, we see his love and his affection for her. So another quotation which really illustrates the deterioration of Macbeth's mental state there, and a lovely one in terms of this dark and ominous animalistic language that pervades the play. Moving into Act 3, Scene 2 some more, Macbeth is now plotting Banquo's murder. He has a plan to deal with that threat. He plots to send assassins to murder Banquo and Banquo's son Fleance. However, he decides not to involve Lady Macbeth in this scheme. He doesn't want to tell her the details of what he's planning. And he says, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed." Now, innocent is a really fascinating word there, I think. He stops short of telling her his full plan, and be innocent, that's an imperative, that's a command. This could mark the start of him becoming more independent in his decisions to commit further violent acts. He's no longer as reliant, perhaps, on Lady Macbeth, but it could also imply a desire to protect her from the guilt and remorse with which he now suffers. He is obviously very directly involved in Duncan's murder, as he, bore the knife himself. So here, perhaps, by refusing to tell Lady Macbeth the details of his crime, is he maybe trying to protect her from the troubles that he is now suffering, the mental struggle to get over that murder? So, moving on, he calls her dearest Chuck. Now, previously, Macbeth has referred to Lady Macbeth as his partner in greatness, but now he uses simpler and more affectionate language. He treats her more as a wife than as an equal, more of a partner. And this could suggest perhaps he's no longer so reliant on her guidance. Now that he is king and has assassins at his disposal, he no longer needs her to help him plot murder. Nevertheless, he says that he thinks she will applaud the deed. Now, this phrase suggests approval. Macbeth expects Lady Macbeth to be pleased once she finds out that he's killed Banquo, given that she was so keen for him to murder Duncan. Now, this could suggest that his idea of manhood is becoming redefined, based around ideas of violence in pursuit of ambition, because remember, that's what he thinks she approves of. She's previously told him that to be more a man, he would need to go ahead with the regicide. So now that he's planning to kill Banquo and Fleance, he may assume that she will be pleased by this and that she'll respect him for it. Okay, but the aftermath of Banquo's murder is again one that unsettles Macbeth deeply. In Act 3, Scene 4, Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost at his coronation feast. So despite having used assassins to kill Banquo, Macbeth suffers really mentally in the aftermath of that killing as he sees this ghost. Whether this is a hallucination or maybe it's a truly supernatural occurrence, that's ambiguous, but in either case, it fills Macbeth with horror. Now, we could interpret this as another guilt-driven hallucination provoked by his heat-oppressed mind, as the ghost appears to condemn Macbeth for his actions. Alternatively, we could interpret this as yet another haunting and disturbing supernatural event within the play. As Macbeth looks at the ghost, which only he can see, he says, "Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me." So, you can't say that I did this, don't shake your gory, bloody head at me. So he uses this phrase, "I did it." Macbeth, speaking to the ghost, directly addresses the crime of Banquo's murder, although it is ambiguous. Perhaps he could be referring to Duncan's murder as well. Macbeth here seems to refuse responsibility, perhaps because he had assassins to commit the killing rather than doing it himself, but he still clearly feels guilt at what he has done, and this could be one explanation for the appearance of the ghost. We could infer that this is yet another guilt-induced hallucination. Not only that, but the ghost is depicted as shaking its head, suggesting perhaps disapproval or shame. As it shakes its head at Macbeth, is this a condemnation of his acts? Is he accusing Macbeth in this silent and haunting way? Gory locks, a very memorable image, this one. This reminds us of the brutality of Banquo's murder, who was beaten and left with 20 trenched gashes in his head. So the assassins that killed Banquo leave him with these awful bleeding wounds. And now this is what Macbeth sees coming to haunt him. So once again, he's confronted with a truly terrifying image. He's not allowed to get away with not seeing the consequences of what he's had ordered done. Alright, so in our next video we will be looking at quotations from the very end of the play, Act 4 and Act 5, and we see how Macbeth begins to change from this fearful, paranoid character into a man who is numb to the effects of his actions. Okay, I hope that was useful for you. Please do join us next time. Thanks for listening.